Have you ever noticed how some nights feel different? Not louder, not heavier, just deeper. Like something inside you is finally being uncovered. No conversations, no explanations, no answers, just silence. And somehow, that silence feels like it's doing something. Not solving everything, but touching something words never reached. Sure, because there are things inside you that were never meant to be processed through language. Not everything you carry can be explained. Not everything you feel can be translated into words. And maybe that's why you feel tired sometimes. Not because you haven't found answers, but because you've been trying to explain something that was never meant to be explained. Some wounds don't respond to reasoning. Some emotions don't soften with logic. Some parts of your soul don't need explanation. They need stillness. There is a quiet kind of healing that only happens when everything stops, when the noise fades, when the need to understand steps aside, and what remains is presence. In the Bible, there is a moment many people overlook. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah was exhausted, not physically alone, but internally. Overwhelmed, empty, and God didn't come to him in noise, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. God came in a gentle whisper. But here's something deeper. The whisper only mattered because there was silence first. Without silence, he would not have heard it. And maybe that's what tonight is for. Not to give you answers, not to fix everything. But to bring you into a place where your soul can finally hear what it couldn't hear before. Not through words, but through stillness. Because silence is not empty. It is full of things you don't notice when life is loud. It holds space. It slows you down. It removes pressure. And in that space, something begins to soften. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped resisting. Some nights are not here to be understood. They are here to restore you. There are things you have said and things you have explained, and still, something inside you remained untouched. Because words have limits. They organize thoughts. They explain situations. They communicate meaning. But they don't always reach the depth of what you actually feel. Sometimes, words become a way to stay on the surface. A way to describe something without truly entering it. You can talk about pain without ever fully feeling it. You can explain a situation without ever releasing its weight. You can say, "I'm okay," and still feel completely unsettled inside. Because words can be controlled, but silence cannot. Silence removes your ability to manage what you feel. It takes away the structure you usually rely on. And what remains is something raw, unfiltered, unedited, and that can feel uncomfortable. Because in silence, you are not explaining anymore. You are experiencing, and that experience is where something deeper happens. There is a reason why many people avoid silence, not because they don't want peace, but because silence removes distractions. And when distractions disappear, what is unresolved becomes visible, not as thoughts alone, but as feeling. And feeling is harder to escape. But here is something important. What silence reveals is not there to overwhelm you. It is there to be acknowledged. Because what remains hidden cannot be healed. And what is constantly explained is not always truly felt. There's something sacred about being in a moment where you stop explaining and start allowing the feeling to exist, allowing the tension to soften, allowing your soul to speak without words. The Bible reflects this in a very quiet way. In Ecclesiastes 3:7 it says, "There is a time to be silent, not as absence, but as purpose." Because silence is not emptiness. It is a space where truth is no longer hidden behind explanation. And tonight, if things feel deeper, if emotions feel closer, if your thoughts feel less structured, it may not be a problem. It may be the moment where something inside you is finally being seen as it truly is. Not described, not explained, but felt. There is a kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a clear moment. Cut on, it doesn't say, "Now you're better." It happens quietly, almost invisibly, and most of the time, you only realize it after it has already begun, because silence does not force change. It creates space for change to happen. And in that space, something inside you starts to soften, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. One of the first things silence begins to heal is internal tension. That constant pressure you didn't even notice anymore. The quiet tightening in your chest, the subtle urgency in your thoughts, the feeling that something always needs your attention. In silence, that tension has nowhere to hide. And because you're no longer feeding it with noise, it begins to loosen. Another thing silence starts to heal is emotional exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from doing too much, the kind that comes from feeling too much for too long. Unprocessed emotions, carried silently, pushed aside, in silence. They are no longer suppressed, but they are also no longer resisted. And that changes how they move inside you. They begin to pass instead of accumulate. There is also something deeper. Silence begins to heal your need to control everything. Because in silence, you are not doing, you are not solving, you are not fixing, you are simply present. And that presence teaches your soul something it rarely experiences, that not everything needs to be managed, that not everything depends on you. And slowly, that realization creates rest. There is also a spiritual layer. Silence creates a space where God is no longer distant. And not because he moved closer, but because you became still enough to notice him. In Psalm 62 it says, "Truly, my soul finds rest in God." But the original meaning points to something deeper. My soul waits in silence, not striving, not searching, not forcing, just being. And in that state, rest becomes natural, not something you create, but something you allow. There is one more thing silence begins to heal. Your relationship with yourself. Because without noise, without distraction, without explanation, you are left with who you truly are. And at first, that can feel uncomfortable. But over time, it becomes peaceful. Because you are no longer trying to escape yourself. You are learning to sit with yourself, gently, honestly, and that is where deep healing begins. There is something many people don't talk about. Silence can feel uncomfortable, not because there is something wrong with it, but because of what it reveals. During the day, it's easy to stay occupied, to move, to respond, to fill every moment with something. And in that movement, You don't have to face what's inside. Ma. But when everything stops, when the noise fades, when there is nothing left to distract you, you are left with yourself. And for many people, that is unfamiliar, not because they don't know who they are, but because they rarely sit with it, without distraction, without explanation, without escape. Silence removes what you usually use to manage your internal world. It takes away the constant input, the stimulation, the noise, and what remains can feel exposed. Not in a harmful way, but in an honest way. That's why silence can feel uncomfortable at first, because it reveals what has been present all along. Unresolved thoughts, unprocessed emotions, quiet fears, hidden tension, and without distraction, those things come closer, not to overwhelm you, but to be seen. There is also a deeper spiritual layer. Silence removes the illusion of control, because when you are silent, you are not managing everything. You are not directing every outcome. You are not filling every space. You are simply present. And that presence requires trust. Trust that not everything needs your control. Trust that not everything needs your intervention. Or trust that God is still present, even when you are not doing anything. And that kind of trust can feel unfamiliar if you're used to holding everything. That's why silence can feel like a loss of control. But in reality, it is an invitation to something deeper. In Psalm 46:10 it says, "Be still," not as a suggestion, but as a doorway. Because stillness is where you begin to recognize something, that your life is not sustained by constant effort, that your existence is not dependent on continuous control, that there is a presence holding what you cannot hold. And when you begin to experience that, silence no longer feels empty. It feels safe. It feels grounding. It feels like you don't have to carry everything inside you all the time. But that shift, or doesn't happen instantly. At first, God's silence exposes. Then, it softens. And over time, it restores. At some point, you begin to notice what silence does. It slows you down. It removes distractions. It brings things closer. And your first instinct is to leave, to reach for something. Your phone, a thought, a distraction, anything that fills the space again. 1. Because staying in silence can feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar can feel uncomfortable. But here is something important. You don't need to force yourself to stay. You don't need to fight the discomfort. You don't need to become completely still all at once. You simply begin by not leaving immediately. That's where it starts. When you notice the silence, pause. Just for a moment. Let the space exist without filling it. When even if it feels strange, even if your mind starts to move, you don't have to stop your thoughts. You don't have to control what appears. You only need to not follow it. There is a difference between noticing and engaging. In silence, you learn to notice. A thought appears. You see it, but you don't build on it. A feeling rises. You feel it, but you don't resist it. Thus, that space between what appears and what you do with it is where calm begins. There is also a physical way to stay present. Bring your attention to your breath, not forcing it, just noticing the air moving in, the air moving out, again and again. Your breath becomes an anchor, not to escape the silence, but to remain within it. There is also a deeper layer. And instead of trying to make the silence peaceful, allow God to meet you in it, not through effort, not through long words, but through awareness. A simple recognition, I am here and God is here. That changes the entire experience, because now you are not alone in the silence, and silence stops feeling empty. It begins to feel full of presence, full of stillness. Full of something that doesn't need to be explained. Psalm 37:7 says, "Be still before the Lord." Notice this, not just be still, but before the Lord. Because stillness is not just a mental state. It is a place of relationship. And when you begin to experience that, silence becomes less about what you feel and more about who is with you. And that makes it easier to stay. There is a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when something inside you begins to shift, not because everything around you has changed, but because you stopped running from what is within you. When you stop escaping silence, you also stop escaping yourself. And that is where real change begins. At first, it doesn't feel like peace. It feels like exposure, like things are closer, clearer, more present. But if you remain, if you don't rush away, something begins to soften. One of the first changes is how you experience your thoughts. Before, they felt urgent, demanding, like they needed immediate attention. But now, they begin to lose their intensity, not because they disappear, but because you are no longer feeding them with reaction. You see them, but you don't become them. That difference creates space, and in that space, there is calm. Another change happens in your emotions. What once felt overwhelming begins to move differently. Instead of building up, it flows. Instead of staying trapped, it passes, because you are no longer resisting what you feel, and resistance is what keeps things stuck. There is also a deeper shift. Your relationship with discomfort changes. You no longer see it as something to escape immediately. You begin to recognize it as something that can be present, without controlling you. And that recognition reduces its power. There is also a spiritual transformation taking place. When you stop filling every moment, you begin to notice what has always been there. Not louder, not dramatic, but steady. A quiet awareness of God's presence. Not as an idea, but as something real. In Lamentations 3:26 it says, "It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." Not rushing, not forcing, not filling the silence, but remaining. And in that remaining, your soul begins to settle. There is also a subtle kind of strength that starts to form. Not loud, not visible, but stable. Just because you are no longer dependent on constant movement to feel okay. You can be still, you can remain grounded, you can be quiet, and still feel present. And that changes how you experience everything. Because now, peace is not something you chase. It is something that begins to stay. There is something quietly happening in the moments you don't fully understand. Not visible, not immediate, but real. Because not all of God's work is meant to be seen as it happens. Some of it takes place in silence, in stillness, in the spaces where nothing seems to be moving. And And that can feel confusing. Because you're used to progress looking like change, looking like movement, looking like clarity. But in the deeper parts of your soul, change doesn't always look like that. Sometimes it looks like nothing. No answers. On no direction. No clear sign that anything is happening. And yet, something is. Because silence is not absence. It is preparation. There is a pattern throughout the Bible that often goes unnoticed. Before something shifts outward, something settles inward. Before direction becomes clear, the heart becomes still. Before action, there is alignment. Jesus himself often withdrew into quiet places. It was not to escape, but to remain connected, to be still, to be with the Father. And it was from that stillness that clarity came, that direction emerged, that strength was renewed. And maybe tonight, what feels like nothing happening is actually a quiet kind of work, not outside, but within you. Something being adjusted, something being reordered, something being softened. Even if you don't have words for it, even if you don't understand it yet, God does not require constant activity to be present. He does not need noise to act. He does not depend on your clarity to move. Isaiah 30:15 says, "In quietness and trust is your strength, not in striving, not in forcing, not in figuring everything out, but in quietness and trust." That means there is strength in what feels still. There is movement in what feels slow. There is purpose in what feels silent. Even now, in this quiet moment, you are not paused. You are being shaped, not rushed, not pressured, but gently formed from the inside out. Restoration doesn't always feel like something new. It often feels like something softening, something easing, something becoming a little lighter without a clear reason. Because when something is being restored within you, it doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in small shifts, subtle changes you almost overlook. One of the first signs is this: what once felt intense no longer feels as overwhelming. The situation may still be there. The questions may still exist, but your internal response is different. There is less urgency, less pressure, less tension. And that matters, because restoration doesn't always remove what is around you. Sometimes it changes how it lives within you. Another sign is your ability to sit in stillness. What once felt uncomfortable now feels a little more natural. Not completely easy, but no longer unbearable. And that shift is a sign of internal stability. There is also a quiet emotional change. You begin to feel less reactive, less pulled in different directions, less overwhelmed by what appears. Not because nothing affects you, but because you are more grounded. And grounding is a sign of restoration. There is also a deeper awareness that begins to grow. You start to sense that you are not alone, not as an idea, but as a quiet knowing. Even in silence, even without words, there is a presence, a steadiness, a covering. Psalm 16:8 says, "I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken." That kind of steadiness doesn't come from circumstances. It comes from something deeper, something being restored within you. There is also a shift in how you relate to your thoughts. You don't follow every thought anymore. You don't build on every feeling. You allow things to pass more naturally, more gently, and that creates peace. Because peace is not the absence of everything, it is the presence of stability. And maybe you haven't noticed it fully yet. Maybe it feels too subtle, too quiet, but something is already happening. Something is already shifting, not loudly, but deeply. And in that depth, rest is forming. There comes a point when silence no longer feels like something you are facing, but something you are resting in. Not because everything became clear, not because every question was answered, but because something inside you is no longer resisting this moment. The need to explain softens, the urgency to understand fades, the pressure to respond becomes quiet. And what remains is a kind of stillness that doesn't ask anything from you. You are not required to hold it together here. You are not required to figure it out. You are not required to carry anything forward into this moment, because this moment is not about movement. It is about presence. And in presence, there is enough time. There is a quiet kind of safety in realizing that nothing needs to happen right now for you to be at rest. That nothing needs to change in order for this moment to be held. There is a verse that reflects this in a simple way. In Psalm 131 it says, "I have calmed and quieted my soul, like a weaned child with its mother." Notice the image. Not striving, not reaching, not asking, just resting, held, safe, without effort. And maybe this is what this night is gently leading you toward. Not answers, not explanations, but a quieter place within yourself. A place where you are no longer trying to move forward, but simply allowed to be still. There is nothing more you need to do here. Nothing more you need to reach. Nothing more you need to resolve. Just remain. And let this stillness hold you for a moment longer.